Viewers' discretion is advised. Some content within this video may not be suited for people under the age of 18.
Coming.
Hey, what's going on guys? My name is Brett Madigan from Baker Games and welcome to my review of Outlast 2 for PC. Outlast 2 is a first-person psychological horror title developed and published by Red Barrels for PS4, Xbox One, and PC. Will the sequel outperform the original? Let's find out. This section may contain mild story spoilers, but let's be real, most of this stuff is in the blurb or in trailers anyway, so who are we kidding at this point? Outlast 2 doesn't shy away from throwing the player directly into the thrill from the get-go. Within the first 5 minutes of the game, you've already become aware that this universe is plagued with insanity. I like to see that in horror games. Some take way too long to get interesting, or ruin the suspense along the way. But not in Outlast. Oh, not in Outlast. To limit the amount of spoilers within this review, I'll briefly go over the narrative, then get into some of the elements that annoyed me. You guys should know me by now. If there's a problem, I'll outline it with red tape. The story of Outlast 2 begins by showing the player why the protagonist, Blake Langerman, and his wife Lynn are seeking answers to a pregnant woman's murder in rural Arizona. Now forgive me for being crude, but why are you explaining this via text? Okay, I won't be that guy that critiques everything, or you'd be here for a while, but I want to show that the backstory, if you can call it that, was presented in a manner that's rather odd. Most of the information about their apparent investigation is blasted at the player in light speed.
2 weeks ago, a young woman was found wandering, barefoot, pregnant, and alone on a barren stretch of highway 100 miles from the nearest... What?
At first glance this may seem fine, though when you play the game more and more, you'll find that the backstory section quickly becomes redundant, meaning that you'll never touch this plot point ever again, unless Red Barrels are trying to link the pregnant woman with the endgame sequence, which I won't spoil, but you could probably hazard a guess as to what that might be. This was an issue I had with the first game as well. I just hoped that they could move on from that. Was this a big deal? No. Though being a game built around storytelling, it felt like something was just missing from the start.
Oh, Jesus!
Would it not have helped the narrative to provide a proper backstory that was more meaningful to the player? Like a cutscene that showed the relationship between these characters, or a reason as to why they're traveling by helicopter. I'm sorry, but I need more than because a pregnant woman was murdered for this to even be remotely believable. I say this because as a player, I wanted to understand these characters, why I should care about either Blake or Lynn. The main reason why this was an issue for me was because I felt no connection to Blake's wife. More on that later. It appeared that there were chunks of the investigation narrative that were loosely sprinkled throughout the game, or at least the start, yet the developer went out of their way to make it seem important. Beyond the start, most of it isn't even presented to the player again.
Jane Doe. Sorry? Your daughter. She was 8 months pregnant, blonde hair, cut like a boy's. Yeah.
The helicopter crashes due to what appears to be some sort of EMP. This element isn't actually explained. It's just assumed knowledge that it was some sort of mind control wave. But tell me how? Oh wait. They might be leaving this out intentionally to sell us prequel DLC. Yay. Shortly after this, Blake wakes up to the rubble of a broken helicopter, though both the pilot and his wife are missing. This is where the story gets weird.
Fuck.
I want to outline a few things that broke the game's immersion before getting into the crucial narrative issues. This time around there are school sequences which act as the psychological pull for the narrative, so related to Blake having repressed memories about a horrible childhood event. At first you don't think anything of them, as it's mostly just aimlessly walking around until the game triggers an out for you. Throughout the game, these sequences get quite tiresome and repetitive. Clearly the developer needed time to kill, so these sections were added. There is little to no plot information presented to the player, thus making these scenes intrusive and immersion-breaking without cause.
We're not alone here.
Okay, back to the narrative without getting too spoilery. It boils down to 3 religious factions. The Heretics cult led by Val, who believes the Antichrist should be born, for whatever reason.
I wanna see her true face.
For this one, I couldn't find an actual reference to the name, so I'm going with what Google tells me. They are called Testament of the New Ezekiel, ruled by a rambling old man called Noth. This guy believes that the Antichrist shouldn't live, and so is killing all the babies who are born within the village. Don't see why that links it, but okay.
I'm so sorry. Where is the woman?
And lastly, the Skald, who are former members of the Testament of the New Ezekiel, and now outcasts of that cult group. Each faction has their own motive for the crazy they ooze out.
Is the Skull Messiah? You half-wit dog's cut.
He ain't been transubstantiated yet.
Though I don't understand any of this stuff because I wasn't brought up that way or took any interest in religion. So you can bet your bottom dollar that I have no idea what's going on and was so confused. Before I continue, I do want to outline a section of gameplay that was so crucial to the narrative that the developer purposely slowed the characters down. I'll play the section and let me know if you see what's wrong here.
Oh shit. We have to run.
If both the characters were running like Lynn said, then they may have actually gotten away at the start of the game, and the outcome would have been totally different. But no, the developer thought the need to force the player to walk slowly. Now, Lynn didn't appear to be puffed out or concerned for her walking abilities. Even so, Blake could have carried her. Blake's goal is to save his wife. If they were running like Lynn said, then he would have completed this objective within the first 20 minutes of the game.
I need... Oh god.
Jesus Christ, Lynn! What's happening here?
You were dead.
As a narrative, the story was heavily disjointed by forced chase sequences and the school sections that after a while became the main focus of the narrative. The pacing of the narrative within Outlast 2 is shaky at the best of times. The moment-to-moment plot points get ruined by the sudden shifts in gameplay style, going from a slow-paced real-world scene to a stopping current narrative to explore what appears to be a hallucination or daydream experienced by Blake, to a chase. What? It just felt like there wasn't a clear outcome to where the story was taking me for a good portion of the game. What is Outlast? Outlast was a claustrophobic horror experience driven by invoking fear by having the player vulnerable to attacks, or by the anticipation of what might be lurking in the shadows. This worked really well for the first game, though I found myself not really feeling scared per se, but more creeped out by the events taking place. Outlast 2 seems to have forgotten this and tries to be something new. Yes, new isn't always a good thing. What do I mean by it not being a good thing? So this time we have a more open world environment, which is great, don't get me wrong. It's more how the developers chose to use this new open space that's the problem. With that open space, how do you drive the player into going the direction you want? You add linear pathways. That's the issue here, more open space that isn't interactable or lootable, which leaves the player wandering around trying to find items that just aren't there. It's the illusion of a free roam ability. Why would Red Barrels do this with their marketing push was more towards open environments? Sure, you aren't confined as much as the first game, yet there still aren't a lot of options either. Usually it's find a crawl space, find a jumpy over bit, or find a door you can push a bookcase out the way. Why is this the go-to? If I was a crazy loon, why would I cover my only entrance with a bookcase? Is the logic off, or am I overthinking this? What I found rather odd at the beginning of the game was that there was a puzzle that required a key to open the door, yet there weren't many other puzzles like this throughout the game. Just a little thing to think about, I guess. Maybe I'm just overthinking it a lot, due to using the crawl spaces in the first game as my own sort of safe haven, essentially slowing the game down to avoid enemies. Outlast 2 seems to do that sort of thing on its own, by forcing the player into stealthy sequences that consist of you waiting for an enemy to walk far enough away that they don't hear you standing up. Without a doubt the most frustrating stealth sequences of any game to date. I don't care if I'm playing on Nightmare difficulty, there is no way either Marta, the Scythe Lady, or normal enemies can see me through pitch blackness, or hear me walking from 50 meters away. If she's a superhuman, please elaborate on this. Otherwise, it just felt like a balancing issue. Now, there is a patch to fix this, so let me show you what this patch did for Nightmare difficulty. So this balancing patch essentially makes sections of the game a little bit easier for the player, yet playing on Hardcore was rather different from playing on Nightmare, as there were a few gameplay interactions outright removed. More on that in a second. Take a look at this scene for example. Before the patch on Hardcore, the developer introduced a hide and seek sequence with the leader of the Skald, which was hard, don't get me wrong, but nothing that broke the game. Yet is not actually present at all anymore, whereas before it was more, I'm stealthily behind him, hiding in the grass, waiting for him to go away. On Nightmare, or after the patch, he wasn't there at all. The second scene where you're being hunted by the guy this time, he's having a good old time lobbing arrows at you. By the third arrow, he was in your face trying to break in. On Hardcore. On Nightmare, however, he wasn't doing anything cool. He just stood in the shadows lobbing arrows at me, basically waiting for me to leave. I'm not too sure where Red Barrels went with this balancing patch. It appears as if they just altered scenes entirely to make them a lot easier, rather than actually balancing the difficulty of each level. How did this patch get approved? With snail mail? I'm playing on Nightmare, dude. I don't need the game to be easier. The aspect of gameplay that annoyed me more than the school sequences, which was difficult to top, was the abuse of chase scenes. We get it, they're hunting us down ferociously. That doesn't mean a chase scene is needed every 5 minutes. After a while, you start to get really sick of them, to the point where it's more of a chore than a fast-paced action sequence. To top it off, the developer thought it was a great idea to add chase scenes within the mine. Mate, I'm not sure if you know what the inside of a mine actually looks like, but damn son, those things are an actual maze! One wrong turn whilst being chased, you're straight up dead. They're basically trial and error moments, which led to me being more angry at myself than I was at the game. I kept making the same mistakes over and over due to the repetitive nature of them. You'd get finished with one, and a second later you'd be getting chased again. The developer didn't give us enough time to relax or wait for a build-up to the next chase. If I don't have you convinced yet that the developers went out of their way to force the player to stay in the game longer, then take a look at this raft scene. It felt like it went over an hour just to get up the bloody river. I felt like it would have been quicker for me to get off the raft and walk to my objective. It's moments like these that pull me out of the game's immersion. You might be thinking, well, they have to do this from time to time. But do they really need to force you to spend over an hour on the worst raft ever? No, they don't. Before I finish up the gameplay section of this review, could someone please tell me what in the hell that light was all about? There's a note in the game that refers to the Murkoff Corporation from the first game. But that's a bit of a stretch to link them into this game based on one note, don't you think? Red Barrels. If they do anything near perfectly, it's sound design. Not only do they provide the player with a constant sense of creepy vibes, but I was more surprised that this feeling went on throughout the entire game. So well done, guys. Realistic sound is something that gives me chills. If you can provide that feeling, then I love you for it. To me, that's what true horror is. If you nail sound, and I'm always on my toes, then you've done your job right. Obviously, sound can break immersion if you get pulled out of it, like previously mentioned, but seriously, just take a listen to this scene.
Be careful, little eyes, what you see. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. There's a Father up above, and he's looking down in love. So be careful, little eyes, what you see.
If I had to point out some strange things with sound, it would have to be during scripted scenes, like this scene, where you have to turn a crank. Then just before you get to your escape route, the enemies spawn.
The newest of the fury of the Lord comes upon me!
I wouldn't have a problem with this approach if the enemies spawned further away so we could hear them in the distance, whilst turning the crank, hearing them moving closer. To me, that would have been rather neat, or at least a more effective way of adding a fear factor to this section of gameplay, rather than just simply spawning them nearby and hoping the player got away. Essentially, I'm just nitpicking at this point, so other than that, the sound design was spot on.
That should do the trick.
Red Barrels always seem to pin the nail on the donkey in just the right place when it comes to visuals. Their environments are beyond stunning, running on Unreal Engine 3 that doesn't come at a surprise at all. When it comes to PC optimization, there are some developers out there that really need to take notes from these guys. They know how to make it run on PC. Making the transition from the absolutely stunning to utterly gruesome environments is nearly seamless. There is nothing better than sneaking through a village to then be plonked back into the crazy nearly straight away. Red Barrels really don't want you to take in the environment, even though it's so beautiful. Why? What's your problem, guys?
The stray sheep must be correct.
Even though the game does use gore as a way to invoke fear or creepy vibes, the developers still nailed the look and feel of a crazy, disgusting universe.
Jesus. I'm afraid for refrigeration.
Verdict time. If sound and visuals were the game's only aspects, it would get a 10 out of 10. There being mostly repetitive gameplay with school sequences ruining immersion, and the disjointed or confusing narrative just not hitting the mark, there's no way I'm going to sit here and pretend that this game is perfect. Maybe with a little tweaking to the school scenes, to maybe, I don't know, make sense, or spicing up the gameplay in a way that doesn't feel forced. Nobody likes to be forced into trial and error situations in a narrative-driven game. For me, it shows a lack of creativity. I felt as if the developer ran out of ideas, and that's what got put in at the end. These scenes were straight up time filler and outright annoying by the end game. Towards the end of the game, right before the chase sequences started to take focus, I was really enjoying the experience, minus a few bumps here and there. Even though I felt like Red Barrel's removed stealth for action, it was a pretty solid game up until those points. Having a game world that's more open this time around didn't benefit Red Barrels as much as I think they had hoped for. Open environments are good and all, but if you aren't utilizing that environment, then what's the point? You may as well just create another game with narrow pathways. Red Barrels did help guide the player by using light sources in scenes that weren't so easy to follow the path, yet it didn't really help in moment-to-moment decision making, particularly during chases. But at least it wasn't trial and error, so I guess that's good. I'm sure the developer was trying to go for a more elaborate narrative this time around, making it all complex and weird, though it makes it extremely difficult to follow if the keynotes of the dialogue are mostly ramblings by the antagonist.
God's too strong already. You've murdered paradise.
As a player, it didn't make sense for me to sift through the dialogue to try and make sense of it all, or there were way too many key plot points missing or unanswered for me to even care, which was sad. It's difficult to tell if that was intentionally done by the developer, to potentially see how the audience interprets the narrative. I still have no idea. Red Barrels clearly had a story they wished to present, but why waste its potential on rambling dialogue that isn't important? The experience could have been improved with a clearer tie-in for the school sequences or a proper backstory.
Did I interrupt something between you two?
Outlast 2 gets a 6 out of 10 from me. I'm Brett Madigan, thank you for checking out my review of Outlast 2, and I'll see you in the next one.